moved to a small rural community a few years ago. I grew up in a fairly large city, and I was never really one for that kind of loud and chaotic lifestyle. In the city, it was noisy all the time, with sirens wailing, traffic buzzing, and people constantly rushing around without ever stopping to look at the sky. As soon as I was old enough and could finally afford to live on my own, I made the decision to pack up and move away. The town I moved to is very small, nestled right against the mountains. The surrounding forests and mountains are absolutely beautiful, no matter what season of the year it is. In the autumn, the leaves turn into a stunning sea of red, orange, and gold. And in the winter, the heavy snow makes the entire landscape look like a postcard. It almost blows my mind that this little town is not more of a tourist trap in the summer and fall. But honestly, I am glad it is not. The quiet little town does not have much to offer in terms of modern entertainment. There are a few local restaurants, a couple of quiet bars, a single gas station that also does mechanical repairs, one small supermarket, and a tiny police station. That is basically the entire town. Even the closest Walmart is about an hour drive away. My little paradise of a town is really off the grid, and I would not want it any other way. I have been living in this town for over 3 years now, and other than one horrible day, it has been absolutely great. But as I eventually learned, even the most peaceful and idyllic towns can sometimes hide incredibly dark secrets. When I first moved to town, I needed a way to make some extra pocket money, so I got a part-time job at the local supermarket. Back in my hometown, I used to manage one of the major grocery store chains, so I already had a lot of retail experience. My daily routine was pretty simple. I would head into the store first thing in the morning, around 5, to unload the delivery trucks and stock the shelves before the customers arrived. The owner of the supermarket noticed my work ethic and eventually offered me a full-time management position, but I turned him down. I only wanted to work part-time. I wanted just enough money for extra spending and a good excuse to get out of the house. The truth was, I already had another part-time job that I did online, and that was where the bulk of my actual income came from. What I really wanted was as much free time as I could possibly afford, so that I could go hiking and fishing as much as possible. There are so many endless woodlands in this region that it would easily take me an entire lifetime to hike all of them. Of course, I was fully up for the challenge. So, on every single day off, whether it was raining or shining, I would select a brand new area of the forest to explore, pack my gear, and head into the thick woods for the entire day. It did not take me long to fully transition into this peaceful new lifestyle. Almost immediately after unpacking my boxes in my new home, I started hitting the wilderness trails and trying to get to know the locals. In the evenings, I would usually grab a bite to eat at one of the small diners in town, and I quickly learned that almost everyone living in this area was unexpectedly pleasant and welcoming. Everyone except for one specific person. I am referring to a local man named Hector. Now, I should clarify that Hector was not initially mean or rude to anyone. He was just incredibly strange. He was the kind of person who seemed to exist on an entirely different planet. The very first time I met Hector, I had just arrived at the supermarket a little after 5 in the morning. I parked my car, and as I was opening my door to step out into the chilly morning air, this man suddenly ran right up to my car window, where I grew up in the city. If a stranger suddenly rushes your car window at 5 in the morning, your immediate survival instinct kicks in, and you prepare for a fight. You might even punch them before they can lay a hand on you. But things were different here. I threw my hands up in a defensive position and began yelling at him to back away. Instead of backing off, he screamed directly in my face and then simply skipped away. He did not run or walk. He legitimately skipped like a happy child. As I stood there in the parking lot, completely confused and trying to calm my racing heart, one of my coworkers walked up to me. She told me that the man was named Hector and that he was completely harmless. Apparently, Hector had lived in or around the town for a very long time, but nobody actually knew where his home was. Everyone in town just assumed he was homeless and likely lived under one of the old bridges in the area. The locals just left him alone and let him wander the streets because he had never hurt anyone. It was certainly alarming to have a strange man scream directly in my face on my first week of work, but since the entire town insisted he was harmless, I decided to just let it go and try to ignore him. Over the next few weeks, I began to see Hector everywhere I went. It did not matter if I was driving to the supermarket at the crack of dawn or walking out of the local bar after 11 at night. I would constantly spot him just wandering the quiet streets. He was a very short man, but he was incredibly strong-looking. He was built like an absolute ox. He could not have been taller than 5 feet 3 inches at the very most, but his shoulders were wide and his arms were thick. He was always wearing the exact same outfit, which consisted of a heavily stained white tank top and a pair of royal blue pants. I could never quite tell if the pants were old jeans or heavy sweatpants. He had a long, dirty gray beard that reached down to his chest, and his remaining hair was tied back into a long ponytail, even though he was completely bald on the top of his head. But even with this incredibly bizarre appearance, the most notable and unforgettable thing about Hector was his skipping. Every single time you saw him moving down the street, he would be skipping. Sometimes, watching him skip along without a single care in the world made me feel almost envious of his blissful ignorance. One morning, as I was driving my usual route to work, I saw Hector standing on a street corner. He was facing the opposite direction of my approaching car. As I got closer to the intersection, I noticed that he was waving his hand enthusiastically to someone across the street. But when I actually drove through the intersection and looked over, my stomach dropped slightly. There was absolutely nobody there. The sidewalk across from him was completely empty. He was waving at thin air. Not only that, but he began talking to this empty space, gesturing wildly with his hands and looking incredibly animated. Even though there was no one around, I just kept my eyes on the road and continued driving, telling myself to mind my own business. Honestly, it is not that unusual for someone in Hector's mental state to talk to themselves, especially in a quiet town where people just let them be. As long as he was not a danger to himself or anyone else, I really did not care what he did with his time. That next weekend, I decided to hit the woods on my day off. I spent several hours hiking through a deep, dense section of the forest that I had not yet explored. I was miles away from the main road, surrounded by towering pine trees and thick brush. While I was deep in the heart of this wilderness, the peaceful silence was suddenly broken. I thought I could hear the faint sound of a human voice echoing through the distant trees. Now, hearing any kind of human voice when you are this deep in the woods is incredibly alarming. You have to remember, this was not some maintained public park trail with families and dog walkers. This was raw, untamed wilderness. Hearing a voice out here immediately causes your survival instincts to flare up. I knew it was risky, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know where that voice was coming from and who else was out here. Instead of turning around and retreating back toward my car, I began to quietly move toward the sound. As I got closer, the voices became clearer, and I could tell that one of them sounded like it was in deep distress. I reached into my pocket, gripped my pocket knife just in case things went bad, and continued to sneak through the undergrowth as quietly as I possibly could. The voices were coming from just behind a very thick grouping of pine trees directly in front of me. I held my breath, pressed my body against a tree trunk, and peeked through the branches. I could not believe what my eyes were seeing. It was not a group of people at all. It was just Hector. He was standing in a small clearing, completely alone, but he was holding an intense conversation with himself, rapidly switching between two completely different voices. One of the voices was incredibly angry, hostile, and belittling. This angry voice was calling Hector a coward, shouting cruel insults at him. Then, like the sudden snap of a finger, the angry voice would vanish, and Hector would start weeping hysterically. He would use a completely different high-pitched voice, begging for mercy and pleading for forgiveness. One of the most terrifying aspects of this entire scene was how distinct the voices were. They sounded like two entirely different people sharing one physical body. I decided right then and there that I was going to stay hidden behind that tree. I had absolutely no intention of stepping out and engaging with him in this state. But as I stood there frozen, the angry voice suddenly came back. Without Hector even turning around to look in my direction, he screamed at the top of his lungs. "He is hiding behind the tree. This time you cannot let him get away." My blood ran cold. Before I could even process what he had just said, I watched Hector spin around and look directly at the exact tree I was hiding behind. For the very first time since I had moved to this town, I did not see a harmless, eccentric man. I saw genuine, unadulterated rage burning in his eyes. I took a frantic step backward, my mind racing as I tried to comprehend how he knew I was there. I did not have time to think. At that exact moment, Hector charged directly at me. He was screaming a horrifying, guttural shriek. He was no longer skipping. He was sprinting on a full-blown dead run, and he was moving incredibly fast, far faster than a man of his build should have been able to move. I turned on my heel and began running as fast as I could back in the direction of the trailhead. I ran through the thick brush, branches whipping across my face and tearing at my clothes. For what felt like an eternity, I could hear Hector right on my tail. He was crashing through the undergrowth behind me, screaming that I was not going to get out of these woods alive. He would let out a terrifying, manic laugh, and then he would scream again. Every few minutes, the sounds of his heavy breathing and heavy footsteps made it feel like he was right behind me, about to reach out his powerful hands and grab my collar. But somehow, he never did. Eventually, after what felt like miles of pure panic, the sounds behind me began to fade. I finally burst through the tree line and made it back to where I had parked my car. I instantly ducked down behind the dashboard, locking the doors and scanning the tree line in absolute terror. But the woods were silent. Hector was nowhere to be found. I started the engine, sped back to town, and went straight to the local police station. I walked inside, still catching my breath and covered in scratches, and told the sheriff everything that had just happened in the woods. The sheriff, a woman who had run the town's small department for years, looked at me with deep skepticism at first. She simply could not imagine the town's harmless skipping man acting with such violence and rage. But as I described the exact area of the deep woods where the encounter had taken place, the color drained from her face. She turned as white as a ghost. She told me that the location I was describing was incredibly disturbing for her. Years ago, in that exact isolated section of the forest, the remains of a local townspeople had been found. It was a horrific murder that had deeply shaken the quiet community. The killer was never identified, and the unsolved case remained one of the only dark, painful blemishes on the history of this peaceful town. As the sheriff sat there processing my story, she began to put the pieces of a terrifying timeline together. She tried to recall exactly when Hector had first appeared in the town. Her memory was a bit fuzzy, but she realized with absolute dread that Hector had started wandering the streets of the town around the exact same time the skeletal remains were discovered in the woods all those years ago. She looked at me, her eyes filled with sudden urgency, and asked if I could guide her back to the exact location of the clearing. She wanted to bring Hector in for questioning immediately. At the very least, she needed to know why he had violently attacked me and whether he posed a danger to the community. We drove back to the trailhead, and the sheriff led a small search into the woods. We quickly hiked back to the clearing, but Hector was completely gone. The sheriff, who has since retired, became visibly emotional as she stood in that quiet clearing. It was indeed the exact spot where they had recovered the victim's body years prior. Despite a thorough search of the surrounding forest, the police never found Hector. In fact, nobody in the town ever saw him again. It was as if he had simply vanished into the shadows of the forest that afternoon. I still go out and hike in those mountains every chance I get, but the experience has permanently changed me. Every time I step into the woods, I find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting Hector to jump out from behind the trees to finish what he started. I never leave the house without my heavy hunting knife now. Sometimes, the people who seem the most harmless on the outside are carrying the most terrifying darkness within them. I remember asking the locals later why Hector was never questioned back when the body was first found. Nobody could give me a straight answer. Now that I have lived here for a few years, I realize the truth. The local police in this tiny, isolated town were simply not equipped or trained to handle a major homicide investigation. There was never a thorough, detailed investigation. It is a haunting realization, and even now, writing this down and reliving those moments makes my hands shake. It still feels entirely surreal. My My only advice to anyone listening is to always pay attention to your surroundings. You truly never know what kind of unspeakable evil might be hiding behind a harmless, smiling face. I am writing this next account while the details are still completely fresh in my mind. My girlfriend Katie and I just returned home from what was supposed to be a peaceful, multi-day backpacking trip in the mountains of upstate New York. The main reason I feel compelled to write this down right now is that I am still trying to process what actually happened to us out there. The more I sit in the quiet of our apartment and replay the events in my head, the more I start to spiral down a rabbit hole of absolutely insane, terrifying thoughts. 3 days ago, Katie and I began our long-planned hiking excursion. If you have ever visited upstate New York, you know just how breathtaking the mountain ranges can be. When people who live outside of New York think about the state, they almost always picture the crowded streets and towering skyscrapers of New York City. But there is a massive, beautiful wilderness in this state that is incredibly underrated. Katie and I are avid outdoors enthusiasts, and we have hiked through national parks all over the country. Our plan for this trip was to spend 4 days and 3 nights completely off the grid, enjoying each other's company and the peace of nature. The first day of our trip went incredibly smoothly. Aside from a few light patches of rain that rolled through the valley, we did not encounter any issues. We found a beautiful level spot to pitch our tent, cooked a simple dinner over our camp stove, and crawled into our sleeping bags early so we could get a head start on the trail the following morning. But in the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up. The tent was pitch black, but I could immediately tell that Katie was sitting upright next to me. Even in the darkness, I could see the outline of her shoulders shaking. She looked absolutely terrified, which was completely out of character for her. She is usually the bravest person I know. I whispered her name and asked if she was okay. At first, she was breathing so heavily that she could barely form words. She kept tripping over her speech, but eventually, she managed to whisper that she had heard something moving outside our tent. At first, I tried to rationalize it. I told her it was probably just a deer or a small animal scavenging for food. Deer are incredibly common in these woods, and they often wander near campsites at night. But Katie shook her head vigorously. She gripped my hand, her fingers digging into my skin, and begged me not to touch the tent zipper. As I sat there, looking at her, trying to figure out if she had just experienced a severe nightmare, the forest outside went completely silent, and then I froze. I heard it too. There were unmistakable heavy footsteps circling our tent. This was absolutely not the sound of a 4-legged animal. It was the distinct weight of a human being walking slowly through the dry leaves. Whoever was out there was pacing in a slow, deliberate circle around our campsite. Every couple of minutes, the footsteps would pause, and a quiet, high-pitched giggle would echo through the dark. It was a woman's laugh, cold and mocking. Neither of us dared to move a muscle. We lay there in absolute terror, clutching each other and praying that dawn would come quickly. Eventually, after what felt like hours, the giggling and the pacing stopped, leaving us in a heavy, suffocating silence. When the first rays of morning light filtered through the trees, I finally gathered the courage to unzip the tent and step outside. To my immense relief, the campsite appeared to be empty. But as I took a few steps forward, my relief instantly turned to dread. Scattered all around our tent were dozens of rocks that had definitely not been there when we set up camp the previous evening. These rocks were not just lying on the ground. They had been carefully stacked into strange, unnatural formations and arranged in tight circles around our sleeping area. Katie stepped out of the tent, saw the rocks, and immediately told me she wanted to pack up and go home. I look back on that moment now and realize how incredibly stupid I was. I managed to convince her to stay, arguing that it must have been some local teenagers playing a cruel prank on us. The entire day of hiking was miserable. Katie spent the whole time looking over her shoulder, absolutely convinced that we were being followed through the dense trees. I kept stopping to scan the woods behind us, but I never saw any movement. Because of the heavy tension, we decided to cut our hiking short and set up camp early. Katie made me promise that we would pack up at first light and jog all the way back to the car. She was no longer enjoying the trip, and honestly, neither was I. That night, I expected Katie to lie awake in fear, but she was completely exhausted from the stress of the day. As soon as her head hit her travel pillow, she fell into a deep, heavy sleep. I sat up for a long time, listening to the ambient sounds of the forest, slowly starting to drift off myself. But just as my eyes were closing, a soft, distinct whisper right outside the fabric of the tent jolted me completely awake. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked down at Katie, thinking she might have spoken in her sleep, but she was completely still and breathing deeply. Then the whisper came again. It was a soft, melodic female voice, and it spoke directly into the side of our tent, saying, "Come outside, Artie." I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I had never met anyone in these woods, and we had not seen a single soul on the trail. How did this voice know my name? Before I could process the sheer terror of that realization, a second, slightly different female voice whispered, "Yeah, Artie, please come outside. We are waiting for you." I lay frozen, terrified to make a sound. Suddenly, the quiet whispering stopped, and the sounds of running footsteps began. It was not like the slow pacing of the night before. This time, multiple people were sprinting full speed around our tent. As they ran, they began to laugh uncontrollably. It was a chorus of high-pitched, manic cackling that sounded absolutely demonic. The noise was deafening in the quiet night. Suddenly, one of the voices dropped into a shocking, unnaturally deep and loud tone, screaming, "Come outside now." The sudden shout woke Katie instantly. She began to panic, crying out and asking me what was happening. I did not even have time to explain because the people outside began to violently shake the tent. They were throwing their body weight against the fabric, physically shifting our entire tent across the ground. The manic laughter grew louder and more chaotic. We held onto each other, screaming in terror, completely defenseless inside the thin nylon walls. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the chaos stopped. We heard the distinct sound of multiple footsteps running away, deeper and deeper into the dark forest until the sounds faded completely. For 30 agonizing minutes, Katie and I sat in total silence, clutching each other and staring at the tent door. When I finally felt it was safe, I slowly unzipped the flap a few inches to peer outside. Standing exactly 20 feet away from our tent, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was a young woman. She looked to be in her mid-20s. She was standing completely still, staring directly at me with a wide, vacant smile on her face, as if she had been waiting for me to open the zipper. She was wearing a pristine white dress, which looked incredibly bizarre and disturbing out here in the middle of a rugged mountain forest. As our eyes met, she slowly raised her hand and waved at me. I slammed the zipper shut, completely speechless. Katie had looked over my shoulder and witnessed the woman as well. We spent the rest of the night sitting back to back, holding our breath and waiting for the tent to be torn open, but nothing else happened. At dawn, we packed our gear in a frantic rush, leaving behind the strange rock formations and newly placed stick symbols that had been constructed around our campsite during the night. We practically ran the entire distance back to our vehicle, not stopping once until we were locked inside our car. We drove home in absolute silence. I still cannot find a logical, rational explanation for how that woman knew my name, or what her intentions were. The sheer malice of that night has left a permanent scar on both of us. It makes me realize that sometimes the stories we hear about monsters in the deep woods might not be legends after all. This third account is something I have kept to myself for a very long time. I struggle to talk about it because even to this day, I cannot fully explain or rationalize what my friends and I witnessed in the wilderness. Every single year since we graduated from school, my two best friends, Theo and Carlos, and I have made it a strict tradition to spend a long weekend camping and hiking in the deep woods. It is a tradition we have kept alive even now, despite the fact that we are all married and have busy adult lives. When we were teenagers growing up in a small town, we were absolutely obsessed with exploring the outdoors. Our favorite pastime was searching for hidden caves. We found our very first cave when we were 16, and that discovery sparked a lifelong obsession. Over the years, we traveled further and further into remote wilderness areas, specifically hunting for uncharted geological formations. On one of our annual trips a few years back, we were hiking through an incredibly isolated patch of forest when we stumbled across a structure that looked completely out of place. It was a small, run-down cabin nestled deep in the thickest part of the woods, miles away from any known trail or road. As we approached it, we began joking around, pointing out that we were stepping directly into a classic horror movie cliché. We walked up to the dusty windows and peered inside. The interior was completely empty, save for a few pieces of broken, rotting wooden furniture scattered across the floorboards. Carlos, who has always been the most adventurous of our group, immediately suggested we go inside and check it out. Theo and I did not object. Finding abandoned structures in the deep woods is actually more common than people think. Once, years ago, we found an entire makeshift village of decaying huts in a massive forest clearing. We later discovered it had been a temporary living quarters for a traveling circus back in the early 1900s. So, finding an old cabin did not strike us as particularly dangerous. We pushed the creaking wooden door open and stepped inside. In truth, calling it a cabin was a bit of a stretch. It was more like a large, sturdy wooden shed. It consisted of just one single square room with no electricity, no plumbing, and absolutely no signs of modern life. The air inside was incredibly dry and heavy, making it surprisingly difficult to draw a deep breath. Carlos began poking through the debris of a collapsed table to see if there was anything interesting left behind, while Theo and I stood near the center of the room. As we stood there talking, we began to hear a strange, muffled noise. It was a soft, scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged slowly across dirt. Because the room was so small, the sound was incredibly distinct, but we could not immediately pinpoint where it was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from directly beneath our feet. The cabin was built flat on the ground, and clearly did not have a traditional basement. I knelt down and pressed my ear against the dusty wooden floorboards. The scraping sound was unmistakable. It was coming from directly below me. I stood up and began kicking away the broken pieces of furniture in the corner of the room. Beneath a thick layer of dirt and rotten wood, I spotted a rusted iron ring handle set into the floor. My curiosity took over. I gripped the cold metal ring and pulled. The heavy wooden trapdoor creaked open, and a foul, overpowering odor immediately wafted up from the darkness below. It was the distinct, sickening smell of rotting meat. I gagged, pulling my collar up over my nose, while Carlos and Theo stepped back in disgust. I grabbed a clean bandana from my backpack, tied it tightly around my face, and pulled out my high-powered flashlight. Before climbing down the wooden ladder into the darkness, I shone the beam of light into the hole, trying to see what was making the noise. It was too deep and dark to make out any details, but the dragging sound grew noticeably louder. I decided to climb down anyway, driven by a foolish desire to see what was hidden beneath the cabin. The moment my boots hit the ground at the bottom of the ladder, I was struck by how unnaturally cold the air was. It was far colder than any normal basement should be. I shone my flashlight around the room. The floor was made of rough, uneven stones, and the ceiling was supported by two massive wooden beams on either side of the chamber. Carlos and Theo called down from the trapdoor above, asking what I could see, but before I could answer them, my flashlight beam caught movement. Limping slowly out from behind one of the massive structural beams was a man. He looked incredibly ordinary at first glance. He was wearing a simple green t-shirt, blue jeans, and old work boots. He had short, messy dark hair and a clean-shaven face. He did not look particularly old or physically imposing, but as he stepped into the light, my voice caught in my throat. I let out a strange, choked gasp of terror. The man completely ignored my presence. He did not look at me or acknowledge the bright flashlight beam shining directly onto his face. He just kept limping slowly across the stone floor, dragging his right foot behind him with a heavy scraping sound. It was the exact noise we had heard from above. He was breathing with heavy, ragged gasps, as if he was in immense physical pain or desperately ill. I took a step back, my heart pounding, and shouted to ask if he was okay or if he needed help. From the trapdoor above, Carlos was screaming at me to get out of there and leave the man alone. Theo had climbed halfway down the ladder, caught one glimpse of the limping figure, and scrambled back up to the safety of the cabin. Despite my shouting, the man continued his slow, agonizing pace across the room. I could hear him mumbling something constantly under his breath. It was a rapid, low chant, but it was not in English, and the words sounded completely unnatural. I took another step back toward the ladder, my eyes locked on him. Suddenly, the man stopped dead in his tracks. The heavy breathing and the low mumbling ceased instantly, leaving the cold room in absolute silence. He slowly turned his head to look directly at me. Then, with a stiff, mechanical motion, he turned his entire body to face me. He stood completely still, his arms hanging limp at his sides. I began to slowly back away, reaching my hand out behind me to find the rungs of the wooden ladder. The man did not blink. His eyes were completely lifeless, like two dark, empty glass beads. As my hand finally gripped the wooden rung of the ladder, the man suddenly took one single violent step toward me. The sudden movement sent a jolt of pure panic through my body. I scrambled up the ladder as fast as my limbs could carry me, screaming for my friends to run. As we gathered at the top of the trapdoor, we looked down one final time. Standing right at the base of the ladder, staring directly up at us with those horrible dead eyes, was the man. He had raised one hand and placed it firmly on the bottom rung of the ladder, as if he was preparing to follow us up. We slammed the trapdoor shut, ran out of the cabin, and did not stop sprinting until we finally reached the safety of our vehicle. We drove straight to the nearest local police station and reported the strange cabin and the limping man to the authorities, fearing that he might be a missing person or someone in desperate need of medical attention. The police promised to look into it. A few weeks later, we received an update. They had located the cabin and searched the underground chamber, but they found absolutely nothing. There was no sign of the limping man, no personal belongings, and no evidence that anyone had ever lived inside that dark, cold room. The police checked all active missing persons reports in the state, but no one matched the description of the man we had seen. To this day, I have no idea who or what we encountered in that dark room beneath the cabin. My logical mind tells me it was just a squatter who did not want to be disturbed, but my gut tells me we stood in the presence of something truly ancient and evil. We still go hiking every year, but we are incredibly cautious now. If we ever see another cabin in the woods, we turn around and walk the other way. The sheer vastness of our forests and mountains holds secrets that the human mind is simply not prepared to comprehend. Whether it is a violent man living a double life in the shadow of an unsolved murder, a group of terrifying entities whispering your name in the dark of the night, or a lifeless figure dragging its foot in an underground stone room, the wilderness remains a place of deep, unpredictable mystery. The next time you decide to venture off the beaten path, to enjoy the peace and quiet of nature, remember these stories. Always watch your surroundings, keep your survival gear close, and never assume that the woods are completely empty, because sometimes the things that dwell in the deep shadows of the trees are watching you, waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the darkness. Now, as I sit in my living room and look back on all these terrifying events, I cannot help but feel a deep sense of dread. The world is a much bigger and stranger place than we like to admit to ourselves. We build our comfortable cities and our quiet little towns, convincing ourselves that we have tamed the wild. We tell ourselves that the rules of civilization apply everywhere, but the reality is that once you step off the pavement and walk beneath the canopy of old trees, you are entering a different world entirely. A world where the old rules do not apply, and where things that have never known the light of day are free to wander. The wilderness does not care about our laws, our safety, or our peace of mind. It is a place of raw survival, where the line between the hunter and the hunted is razor thin. Think about Hector, the skipping man who seemed so harmless to an entire community. How many people walked past him every day, offering a friendly wave or a spare coin, completely unaware of the raging fire that burned inside him? How many people stood in that same supermarket parking lot, listening to his childish laughter, while a few miles away, the bones of a murdered man lay hidden in a dark ravine? It is a chilling reminder that we never truly know what lies behind the eyes of a stranger. We see what we want to see. We choose to believe in the safety of our small towns because the alternative is simply too terrifying to contemplate. We want to believe that evil is something far away, something that only happens in the movies or in big, dangerous cities. But the truth is that evil can be right next door, skipping down the sidewalk in a stained white tank top and blue pants. And what about the entities that pursued Artie and Katie through the dark forests of upstate New York? How does one explain the sheer, calculated malice of those whispers? To hear your own name spoken by a voice in the dark, miles away from any other living soul, is a psychological horror that is almost impossible to recover from. It suggests a level of monitoring, a degree of surveillance that is deeply unsettling. It means that they were not just randomly targeted, they were watched, they were studied. Their names were learned, and their movements were tracked with terrifying precision. The rock formations and stick symbols left behind were not just random decorations. They were markers, territorial boundaries, or perhaps even physical warnings. They were a clear message that the campsite did not belong to them, and that they were trespassing on ground that belonged to something far older and far more hostile than they could ever imagine. The girl in the white dress, standing in the moonlight, smiling and waving, is perhaps the most haunting image of all. Why was she wearing a dress in the middle of a rugged mountain forest? Why did she smile so warmly while her companion shook and dragged the tent? It is this strange juxtaposition of the mundane and the terrifying that makes these wilderness encounters so deeply disturbing. It is the realization that whatever is out there is playing by a completely different set of rules. It is a game to them, a form of cruel amusement, and we are nothing more than unwilling participants in their dark theater. The fact that they vanished without a trace, leaving behind only strange symbols and stacked stones, suggests that they are intimately familiar with the forest, capable of moving through the dense trees with a silent agility that defies explanation. And then we have the cold stone room beneath the abandoned cabin. The limping man, dragging his foot in an endless mechanical circle, mumbling a language that has no place in our modern world. Who was he? Was he a man who had lost his mind, seeking refuge in the darkest corner of the earth? Or was he something else entirely? A physical manifestation of the decay and rot that had festered inside that cabin for decades. The sickening smell of rotting meat that filled the chamber suggests a place of death, a place where things go to rot and be forgotten. The way he turned his body, his head moving with stiff, unnatural movements, and the absolute lack of life in his eyes, points to a terrifying possibility. Perhaps he was no longer human. Perhaps he was merely a shell, a physical vessel inhabited by a dark force that has claimed the deep woods as its sanctuary. The single violent step he took toward the ladder was not the action of a weak, ailing man. It was a sudden, aggressive burst of energy, a clear indication that he was capable of immense violence if given the chance. If my friends and I had stayed down in that cold room for even a minute longer, if we had tried to touch him or help him, I have no doubt that we would not have made it out of those woods alive. We would have become just another unsolved missing persons case, another dark rumor whispered among the locals. The fact that the police found absolutely no evidence of his existence when they searched the cabin weeks later only deepens the mystery. It is as if the room itself and the figure inside it existed only for that brief, terrifying moment when we dared to open the trapdoor. It was a glimpse into a hidden layer of reality, a dark pocket of the world that was never meant to be discovered by human eyes. When you pack your bags for your next outdoor adventure, I want you to carry these stories with you. I do not tell them to frighten you, or to keep you from enjoying the beauty of nature. The forests and mountains are indeed beautiful, and they offer a peace that is hard to find anywhere else. But that peace is a fragile thing, and it can be shattered in an instant. The next time you are sitting around a campfire, listening to the crackle of the wood and looking up at the stars, pay close attention to the shadows that dance just beyond the reach of the firelight. Listen to the wind as it rustles through the leaves. Is it just the wind, or is it a soft melodic voice whispering your name? And if you are walking along a quiet street in a small, peaceful town, and you see a short man skipping toward you with a wide, blissful smile, do not just dismiss him as a harmless eccentric. Do not assume that the community is safe just because everyone is friendly. Remember that the woods are always waiting, just beyond the edge of town, and they have a way of swallowing secrets whole. They can hide a body for 15 years, and they can hide the monster that put it there. They can hide a smiling girl in a white dress, and they can hide a limping man in a cold stone basement. We like to think that we are at the top of the food chain, that we are the masters of our environment. But the truth is that we are only safe as long as we stay within the boundaries we have built for ourselves. Once we cross those lines, once we venture deep into the untamed wilderness, we are entering their domain, and in their domain, we are nothing more than visitors. Visitors who must respect the dark, and who must always be ready to run when the shadows begin to move. So as you go about your week, keep your eyes open. Do not take your safety for granted. Pay attention to the strange details, the things that do not quite fit. The man who waves at nothing, the rocks stacked in circles around your tent, the dragging sound beneath your feet. These are the warnings, the quiet whispers of a danger that is drawing close. And if you are ever unfortunate enough to find yourself standing in a quiet clearing, hearing the voice behind you scream your name, do not stop to look back. Do not try to investigate. Just turn on your heel and run as fast as you can. Run back to the lights, back to the noise, back to the safe, crowded streets of the civilization we built to keep the darkness out. Because if you do not, you might just find out what is waiting for you at the end of the chase. And remember, the most terrifying thing about these stories is that they are not legends. They are the lived experiences of ordinary people who went looking for peace and found themselves staring into the eyes of absolute terror. People who came back to tell the tale, but who will never truly be the same again. Every time they close their eyes, they are back in those woods, hearing the footsteps, the whispers, and the manic laughter echoing through the trees. They are still running, still looking over their shoulders, still waiting for the moment when the darkness finally catches up with them. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.